We've talked about global change driven by natural forcings such as volcanism, plate tectonics, changing atmospheric and oceanic chemistry, etc. Now that humans have evolved into the brilliant, successful beings that we think we are, we've solved all of our big survival problems, right? We've worked out global shipping and transportation of food and people, right? We've conquered diseases, right? Let's take a look at some of the things that have happened in the last 170 years in this truly modern world. These events affect us, all of us, to this day. And by to this day, I mean today, as in this afternoon, this evening, and tomorrow. For these events to have occurred requires screw-ups and malfeasance by a lot of people. Population growth, racism, classism, colonialism, and greed play a major role as well. Large groups of people are put in an untenable position by those in charge, and the results can be catastrophic, as we'll see. We're going to start out with the Irish potato famine, which is known as the Great Hunger, and in Ireland it's known as An Gortamar in Gaelica, which is the Irish language. Depending on what your definition of a king is, there were hundreds of Irish kings about 1,000 years ago. One of them got kicked out of Leinster, that's the eastern part of Ireland around Dublin, in the year 1167. He invited a British prince to help him in 1168, and the Brits never completely left to this day. The British divided Ireland up and gave those properties to other Brits that established large landholdings. To support themselves on those properties, the poor turned to raising potatoes. Potatoes came to Europe from Peru and Bolivia originally. Scientists thought they were cool. Rumors among the people of continental Europe thought potatoes were bad. In France, people said potatoes caused leprosy. In England, that they caused windiness and thoughts of love. So flatulence and what they called incitement to Venus. They were mostly fed to livestock. Fast forwarding to the 1840s, potatoes were the main course of most meals of the poor in Ireland. The fungus that causes the potato blight came originally from Mexico and spread to the United States, where it first appeared in the Philadelphia and New York City areas in early 1843, ultimately spreading across the eastern U.S. and Canada by 1843. It crossed the Atlantic Ocean with a shipment of seed potatoes for Belgian farmers in 1845 and quickly spread throughout continental Europe. It was able to easily jump the English Channel to Britain and then across the Irish Sea. All of the potato-growing countries in Europe were affected, but the potato blight hit Ireland the hardest, and one of the reasons was the island's disproportionate dependency on a single variety of potato known as the Irish lumper, or the lumper. This brings us back to something we mentioned earlier on in the course when we were talking about atmospheric and oceanic circulation. This is an image from a document that was published monthly going back to 1771. I'm still not sure why this happened, but the Moravians established a monastery in Nain, Labrador in 1771. And they were fascinated with the weather of Labrador. So people back in Europe regularly read these magazines that talked about the weather of Nain and Labrador. We can still find copies of these manuscripts in places like Freistadt in southern Austria. Now, Nain is located here. As I mentioned earlier, it's not easy to get to. There is a semi-regular flight in the summer, but that implies the weather is going to be fairly good. So we have very detailed records kept by the monks in the monastery here in Nain, again, going back to 1771. And that's important for us. One of the reasons we went there to get a tree is that was the northernmost range of large trees. So we hoped we would get a large tree, and we did get a large tree. It was about 300 years of age when it was cut down. Not by us. It was cut down, we got a slice, which is called a cookie, and we analyzed it for its isotope values. Now, Sandra Timsick had done the reconstruction, and what you can see here is a decline in temperatures to the early 1800s. The year without a summer occurred right in here. We see a climb up out of that cold period into the early 1840s or so, and then we see a decline again. And we're going to focus for a few minutes on this period of time here when temperatures begin to decrease again. And this brings us to Ireland, a place where poor people were forced into raising potatoes as their only means to generate enough food to feed themselves and their families. Much like other European cultures, the Irish would divide their property. When they had sons, the sons split the remaining property. And as you can imagine, if you're poor, you don't have that much property in the first place. If you divide it up a couple times, it's no longer tenable. You can't maintain the health of your family. The future of your family is destroyed, essentially. This is the risk you take when going into a monoculture. Now, they really didn't have a choice, so they had to pay the price. And the result was famine when the potato crop failed, disease associated with the weakened people that are starving, and social breakdown. You stop caring about other people. You stop caring about your country. You stop caring about anything other than food, staying alive. And as a result, a dramatic uptick in riots. Here we have a starvation riot in Galway, people attacking a potato store. Here in Cork, which is located in the southwest of Ireland, we have people fighting over Indian corn. This is corn that came from America. Native American tribes actually helped save numerous people in Ireland by generating money and food to Ireland, even though they themselves didn't have much. And then as a last resort, some people would agree to give up their religion. They would agree to give up Catholicism and become Protestant if they wanted soup to stay alive. So the worst hit areas are here in the southwest. This is Dingle, Kerry, up here, Galway, Connemara, and up into Donegal. So all along the west coast here, the very rocky, wet portions of Ireland where people held on to their culture the longest. This is today known as the Gaeltacht, where people speak Irish as part of their everyday life. And one of the more unpleasant turns that was taken were related to evictions. The people that owned property in Ireland were based loosely in England, at least tied to them, to the wealthy people in England, and their taxes were not cut during the famine. So as a result, the more people they had, the more taxes they had to pay for their property. So they had to get rid of these people. And you couldn't just throw them out of the house because they might move back in. So government agents would come, throw the people out, and then tear the roof down, burn the house, destroy the house. And the people are left then with no alternative but to go onto the road or live in ditches next to the road with some structures built from the destroyed houses. If you go to Ireland today, this is an example of a quaint Irish cottage. Quaint meaning small, and people think it looks cool. It's got a thatched roof. These thatched roofs are supported by the European Union. You get a tax break. I think it's €3,000 a year for having a thatched roof, if you're willing to put up with animals living in here and all the other stuff. So what they would do is tear this roof off the place and knock some of the walls down. And the result is, wherever you go in Ireland today, you see these houses, destroyed houses everywhere. And at first you think, well, that makes for great scenery, but then you think that every one of these represents a family that was destroyed. Either they died from the famine, they died from disease, or they died from exposure. If they were lucky, maybe they moved to Canada or the United States. Inside, they lived a pretty simple life. And this goes to show that even the wealthy people at the time suffered from the famine. So when they could no longer pay their rent, they lost their holdings and their houses fell into disrepair. This is a very large house on the west coast of Ireland that was abandoned a couple hundred years ago. The graveyards show the signs of the famine everywhere you go. In some cases, these are mass burials. People couldn't afford to have a coffin made. They couldn't afford a burial, so they were just thrown into a pit. There are no identities on any of these people. So they're unknown people that went to the poorhouse to stay alive. They died of fever in the poorhouse, most likely, and they were buried in a common pit behind the workhouse. So these are common sites today. This is a field that was adjacent to the workhouse that is filled with bodies. It's underlain by hundreds of people. And also around Ireland, since the 90s, when the economy improved, they put up memorials wherever these fields were known to exist. Some tragedies are commemorated. This is the Duluth tragedy, and it was dedicated to a number of people that were escaping starvation by walking a road looking for work, and they were hit by a gale here and blown into this lake. This is a monument in another small town in Western Ireland. In Gaelic, what this says is, This monument was placed with the purpose of honoring the people of the parish that died in the Great Hunger, the famine on Guatemala from 1846 to 1849. May God have mercy upon their souls. Other examples, this is in Westport, one of the main ports of escape from Ireland. Unfortunately, the ships they used were the worst ships afloat, and they often sank. The ships that didn't sink were so bad, the food was so bad, the water was so bad, that in some cases most people died on the way across the ocean. So they became known as coffin ships. And the result was the departure from Ireland of about 1.5 million people. Another 1 million people died from fever and starvation, and other people just disappeared. Ireland had a population of 8.5 million in 1845. Today it's 3.5 million. So the population has not recovered yet, almost 200 years later. Now, the policy of the British government was laissez-faire, meaning it is what it is. Whatever happens, happens. Something most people don't know about the Great Famine or the Great Hunger is that food was exported from Ireland throughout the entire famine. So there was more than enough food produced to feed everybody in Ireland. In fact, substantially more food than was needed to feed everybody in Ireland. But money crops are worth money, and they can't be interfered with. So if we're going to make money off of something, that's the most important thing. And here we have some contemporary quotes. Ireland was actually producing sufficient food, wool, and flax to feed and clothe not 9, but 18 millions of people. Yet a ship sailing into an Irish port during the famine years with a cargo of grain was sure to meet 6 ships sailing out with a similar cargo. Now, livestock was exported, grain was exported, beer was exported, whiskey was exported. One of the things that people do in times of surplus is they convert grain into alcohol. This is for 2 reasons. 1, people like alcohol, they pay for it. 2, the grain doesn't go bad. You've made something valuable out of that grain before it spoils or gets infested with vermin, rats, whatever. Meanwhile, in India, conditions were probably even worse. Ireland suffered from cold and wet, accompanied by disease and famine. In India, a complete failure of the Indian monsoon had resulted in massive starvation. This was in a time England had firmly established itself as the colonial power in the region. So they had moved people away from traditional ways of farming and living to the commercial benefit of Europeans in India. The result was a series of severe famines, probably the most significant, 1876 to 1877-78. 1896 to 1900. There were also severe famines in 1902, and I believe in 1905 and 1907 that are related to failures of the monsoon. Now, this was at a time, again, when Queen Victoria's people were basically running the world. This is a time when the sun never set on the British Empire, as they said, meaning they had colonies everywhere around the world. Here we have the brave Queen Victoria keeping famine away from the starving children that are starving because of her. You can see that the colonial system maintained itself throughout the famine in spite of the death of millions, literally tens of millions of people on the streets. There was no significant change in the behavior of the people in charge. Some estimated death tolls here. There's generally a high and a low, depending on the author. The generally agreed upon death toll for the 1876 to 79 famine is 8.2 million. In China, which we're not going to cover here, just for completeness, we can see that somewhere between 10 and 20 million or so Chinese died under British colonial rule at about the same time as this Indian famine. Subsequently, the 1896 to 1900 famine in India resulted in the death of close to 20 million people. In China, another 10 million. In Brazil, 1 to 1.5 million. So if you put these together, just these couple colonies together, we have a death toll of somewhere between 32 million and 61 million under Queen Victoria's rule. This is fairly recently. This is the late 1800s to early 1900s. Again, disgustingly perhaps, horribly perhaps, the British continued to export grain from India during the famine. much like the Irish potato famine a half a century earlier, they continued to export food in spite of 10 million people dying. So when we put all these together, the great series of famines, you have maybe 50 million deaths in India alone. And again, this is over a relatively short period of time, from the late 1700s to the 1960s. That's 50 million people that starved to death or died from famine-related disease, not counting the people that died from other causes at this time. When we look at the 20th century as a whole, we see considerable warming of about 1.2 to 1.4 degrees, depending on how it's calculated. Warming began in the 1890s and continues to this day. There have been a couple interruptions. The early 1916 to 1920 was relatively wet, cool in Europe, followed by a warm period in the 20s, followed by cooling in the mid-40s through the 50s to the early 70s, when it was a bit cooler than today. We saw an increase from 1900 to 1939 in westerly winds. That's a zonal flow directly west to east at mid-latitudes in North America, for instance. When we put these together as a series of maps, some of the great, for the most part, negative events of the last 100 years, we see the Asian monsoons suffered a series of failures, which we had just mentioned, going back into the 1870s, where the annual rainfall is missing. We don't have that monsoon period. We don't have the rain that's necessary to produce the food that's necessary to feed the huge population of India. In 1919 to 1938, we see a general warming of the Arctic, and this led people to consider moving further to the north. Subsequently, it was followed by the drought years of 1931 to 1938. Again, we have an increased zonal flow. Winds are moving basically west to east. We also have a high pressure system stationary over the Great Plains of the US and the southern prairies of Canada. So this clockwise circulation around this high is going to bring dry air, warm, dry air throughout this region, throughout the Midwestern U.S., throughout central Canada. This became known as the Dust Bowl in the United States and the Dirty 30s in the prairies, here in Saskatchewan, for instance. 1940 to 1942, we have a warm and weak polar vortex that is going to result in a high-pressure cell being stationed here over the North Atlantic, relatively dry conditions in Western Europe, Scandinavia, and cold conditions in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. That turns out to be critical for the outcome of World War II. Now, World War I started in a dry, warm summer, and quickly Europe was plunged into wet for a number of years, which slowed the war down, drug it out, and resulted in the death of tens of millions of people more than had the weather been different. Same thing in World War II. The war breaks out. The Germans are marching for the Caucasus and Stalingrad. They're trying to take over the oil fields because Germany doesn't have any oil source. And the cold weather stalled them. The German army literally froze to death outside of Stalingrad. That's accompanied with a drought, 1939 to 1945 in Australia, and subsequent mid-latitude droughts from 1945 to 1954, which again affected the southern U.S. and continental Europe. So when we look at the 20th century from a global perspective, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has done for the UN, we see a warming that occurs in stages. So we're coming out of the mid-1850s. We see a spike followed by a cooling that turns into a warming here in around the 1920s and 30s. We increase in temperature to the late 40s, and then we see a decrease and fairly low temperatures until the early 1970s. So we think we understand why this happened now, why we didn't just continue to increase in temperature, why we have this step here. When we look at global temperatures from this perspective, this is from a paper that came out just a few months ago, well, about a year ago, I guess. We see temperatures that range up to 2019, up to last year. And this is relative to the 1880-1910 baseline climate, the 30-year period from 1880 to 1910. So we can see the temperatures have gone up about a degree to almost a degree and a half over the last 100 years. In northern and western Europe, rainfall came starting in particular on the Western Front in 1916. This is when the troops were already bogged down. Now, when the war broke out in 1914, essentially everybody in Europe was related to everybody. That is, everyone in charge of a country was related to everyone else in charge of countries. They were all ultimately related to Queen Victoria, her descendants. So they figured 1914, let's expand our territory a little bit. So everyone thought it was going to be a quick, easy war. It would be fun. What's wrong with that? Well, when the war broke out, it wasn't fun. People got stuck in the mud, and they stayed in the mud for 4 years until eventually the U.S. got talked into joining, and a bunch of fresh soldiers came over from America, and things got wrapped up in a few months, about a year or so. So the spring of 1916 was much worse than usual. Rain fell for several weeks. As artillery shells are falling around France and Belgium, they're grinding up the forest soil. They're grinding up the farmland and turning all of this stuff into loose sediment mixed with water. You end up in this situation where everyone is up to their knees in mud or deeper. Vehicles are useless. Even horses and oxen were used at this time, generally getting stuck themselves. So all this leads to a slowdown in any kind of effort. In Canada, they practiced like this. So in Winnipeg, nice zigzag trenches were cut. People practice in. Toronto practiced on nice, dry, grassy fields. And when the Canadians got to Europe, they ran into this. So this is much more typical of the battlefield situation that they faced. So these pictures here are both of Canadian troops. This is Belgium, but I don't remember which particular army is here. This is Passchendaele. You've probably seen this image before. It's a famous Canadian battle. Took place in November of 1917, a year before the war ended. And you can see some tracks here, remnants of tracks, all that's left other than this tank here. So this was farmland prior to the bombing here, the very intense bombing. Even to this day, people still hit munitions. There's still grenades popping up in bags of potatoes in Belgium occasionally.